are finishing what feels like a sermon series that lasted forever. Now, there's one other request that I have of you. After this sermon series, Pastor DJ is going to share a couple, and then I have some forms out on where you get your bulletin, where the greeters are there, and it says, I've got to know. And so I'm working on the next couple of sermon series, and one of them that I want to do is to answer some of the questions that you have. It could be something about cultural context or a specific story in the Bible. So if there's something, I've gotten a few back that are fantastic, and I'm excited to go through those, but I'm looking for a couple more. So if you have any questions or anything that you would like answered, what does the Bible say about this or that, or maybe parables or stories of Jesus, let me know, fill those out. You can turn it in, you can email it, you can Facebook message us, you can hand me a paper form, whatever it is, but we'd be excited to go through that. Also, to me, this is kind of a big deal. I was thinking about this week, that for months we've been going through the Gospel of John. I probably haven't really admitted this, but one of my goals would be to preach through the entire New Testament at some point. So, you guys have gotten to sit through both Acts and John, and there'll be more. So, but it's really, I hope that as you've gone through this, you maybe feel a little bit of a connection to the gospel, to the story. So when you get in heaven, you can be like, John, I know your story. I'm familiar with your story. We know that he wrote so that we would come to believe. In fact, if you read the very last verses of chapter 20, verse 31, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's why he wrote it. So that we would understand who Jesus is, where he came from, and that we would be saved. Now, this week, as soon as we are done with church, Ashley and I are leaving with our boys. We're all leaving for vacation, and we're pretty excited about it. One of the things that our boys look forward to so much is we let them camp on an island while we're there. And this year, they're like, we are making our own food. I was like, awesome. So you're going to cook your own food over a fire. This will be great. I think it will. We'll see. But John chapter 21 has Jesus cooking over a fire. Jesus has lived, died, rose again, shown up to his disciples a couple of times, and now in chapter 21, he is cooking over a fire. And I was thinking through, that is such a familiar smell. So this week I smoked both pork ribs and grilled chicken for some friends that we had over, and it was pretty awesome. But that smell, it sticks to you. It's one that you can't forget. If you go camping, one of my favorite foods to cook over a fire is to take an apple, cut out the core, pack it full of brown sugar, wrap it in tin foil, and put it in the fire for 45 minutes. It comes out pretty fantastic. You should try it. But those moments of cooking over a fire, being around a fire, it brings back smells. Those smells bring back memories to things that you've done before. And that is some of what is happening in John chapter 21. I actually think it's extremely significant that Jesus showed up at a fire specifically to his relationship with Peter. So, before we get into John chapter 21, I'm going to look through the story of Peter. So I'm going to read 3 different sections of scripture that are about Peter and Jesus' relationship. First one is in Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 4. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners from the other boat to come and help, and they came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at his knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore and left everything to follow him. Going to John 13, verse 36, Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "You will lay down your life for me. Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." You have this amazing moment when Jesus calls Peter. Peter is doing what he knows. He is fishing. He's a professional fisherman. That's how he supplied for his family. You have Jesus who shows up, who is a teacher. And as you read Peter's comment, "But because you say so, we'll try again," I always read it 2 different ways. One is sarcastic, like, "Are you kidding me? Sure, I'll try it just for you," like the teenager response. But it could be that, or it could be that Peter goes, "There's something different about what Jesus is saying, and I'm going to give it a try." I'm not really sure, but either way it worked. So Peter has this amazing moment where he's like, okay, this guy is the real deal. And he's completely like, I need space because I am sinful and I can't be with you. And Jesus is like, yeah, you can. In fact, you're going to follow me. Let's go. Then you have this moment in John 13. Jesus is now looking towards, we are going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be killed. And Peter's like, well, I'll follow you anywhere. I'll do whatever you ask. I'll go wherever you go. I'll lay down my life for you. And Jesus is like, will you really? In fact, you're going to deny me. And we go to John 18. Starting in verse 15, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. This is after Jesus has been arrested. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back and spoke to the servant girl on duty there and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and the officials stood around a fire. Hear that? It was cold, and the servants and the officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Verse 25, meanwhile, Peter was standing there warming himself. So they asked him, aren't you one of his disciples too? He denied it, saying, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you in the garden again? Again, Peter denied it. At that moment, the rooster began to crow. You see, last week, we talked about Jesus' resurrection, and it was a moment that changed absolutely everything. The veil was torn. People's relationship with God was completely different. But one thing that it didn't really change was Peter's feeling of failure. So you had Peter, one of the first people to run to the tomb, brave enough to walk in, and yet he still felt like he had failed Jesus. The resurrection changed absolutely everything, but it didn't change Peter's mind and heart, really. He still felt like he'd completely missed. That he had said, Jesus, I'm following you through absolutely anything. Jesus rose from the dead, and Peter goes, but I still didn't. I still didn't follow through on what I promised. Let's read chapter 21. Afterward, and Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into a boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, friends, haven't you any fish? No, they answered. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing their net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire burning coals. They saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish you have just caught. So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. None of the disciples dare ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. This story follows Peter's calling. When we fail, when we mess up, sometimes we'll go back to the last thing we were successful at. What are we comfortable doing? What do we know how to do, and what can we get done? Peter goes, I've really messed this up. I don't know if I can follow Jesus anymore. I don't even know what following Jesus after resurrection looked like. So I'm going to go fishing. Peter was married. He had a family. And he was probably like, well, I need to do something. So let's go fishing. Which was more of a job than like weekend fishing. So he goes out and he fishes, and again, just like in Luke chapter 5, they catch nothing. Which is, if you fish a lot, there are days where you're like, this is miserable. They catch nothing, and again, Jesus is on the shore. But John is careful to point out that there's something different between Jesus post-resurrection. That Mary didn't recognize him, and Jesus was like, you can't hold me yet. You can't hold on to me. And then the disciples even here, they're like, we know it's Jesus, but there's something different about him, because they're like, we know it's him, but we want to ask if it's him. There's some confusion there. But Jesus, he says, throw your nets on the other side. All of a sudden they're getting all of these fish, and John goes, Peter, that's Jesus. I was reading, and in some translations, it says that Peter put on his clothes because he was naked, and I was like, that sounds like a different way to fish. Okay, whatever. It says that Peter put his clothes on, and he jumps in the water because he needs to see Jesus. But there's this weird tension. Right, as Jesus gets there, he's already cooking fish, and he goes, hey, Peter, why don't you bring some fish over? Jesus is again inviting Peter into this moment. But Jesus didn't really need Peter's fish. He already had some. He gives it to him. He gives him bread and he gives him fish. And then he goes on and he talks with Peter. Verse 15, When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death of which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." You see, Peter had failed 3 different times. The story in John chapter 18 says that Peter was there warming himself by a fire. Again, that smell would have been there. He's warming himself by a fire, and 3 different times somebody said, "You're with Jesus, right?" And Peter goes, No. You've got me mistaken. That's not me. No. Even the person who's connected to the guy that Peter cut his ear off, Peter's like, no, wasn't me. I don't even know him. One of the Gospels, it says that Peter even cursed and said, "I don't know the man." Followed immediately by the rooster crowing, which Jesus said, "Before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me." Can you imagine that punch in the gut? That sound, that rooster sound would have been to Peter? "Jesus, I won't ever deny you. I won't ever leave you. I'll follow you even to death." Followed by, "I don't know the guy." And that moment of hearing the rooster crow. Like, it is no wonder that Peter is going, I failed. I messed this up. I don't even, Jesus rose again, but I don't even know what that means for me anymore. So he goes fishing. And Jesus says, throw your net on the other side, you'll catch fish. Peter realizes who he is, swims in. But can you imagine that weird tension when Peter gets on shore? Peter gets on shore and he's like, "I'm so excited to see you, but I feel like a failure." There's the smell of the campfire. And it has to be bringing back the memories of when he denied him. So Peter failed 3 times, and Jesus invites him back into relationship 3 different times. But it's not just simply relationship that Jesus is inviting him back to. But he is going back to saying, "Peter, I called you, and here is mission. I've called you to be with me, but to follow me. But feed my sheep. Protect my lambs. Feed my sheep." That it is saying, "Peter, you have not messed up so much that there's a barrier here. Come on back. Come on back. Follow me." So much so that Jesus even alludes to how Peter is going to die. We know that Peter died being crucified upside down on a cross, which sounds incredibly brutal. And you wonder if Jesus, it seems like they were walking, because in another verse it says they looked behind them and John was following along, which sounds totally like the smaller cousin thing to do. But you wonder if Jesus is walking with him and he says, "Peter, somebody's going to lead you where you don't want to go." And if he's pointing to his side or his hands. Because somehow they understand that Peter was going to die in a brutal way. Somehow Jesus had communicated that in a way that feels a little bit more than the words that we have. So verse 20, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" Peter saw him and asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Follow me. I give you mission. I welcome you back. This is not too late. Follow me." In the same way that when Peter first saw Jesus, they brought in this whole 2 boatloads of fish, and Jesus said, "You won't fish anymore, you'll follow me." Jesus is going right back to that, saying, "Peter, remember when I said you'll fish for men? That calling has not left you. Follow me." Now, no matter what we do, no matter how we serve Jesus, if that is through being on worship team or up here sharing a message, or if that is working with kids downstairs, or sharing him at your workplace or job, or however it is, the one thing that has to be more important than anything else is that we love Jesus, is that our understanding and our relationship with Jesus comes first. And you can feel that moment when Jesus is calling him back to him. It is both relationship and mission. "Peter, do you love me? Do you love me more than anything else?" He isn't saying, "Peter, do you love me more than these guys love me?" He's saying, "Peter, do you love me more than you love these guys or anyone else?" For us, we need to ask questions like, do we love Jesus more than our job? Do we love Jesus more than our families? Not that we are called not to love our families, but it's, do we love Christ more than absolutely anything else? And it is a radical question for us to wrestle with. And like Peter, we will succeed at it in moments, and we will fail at it in moments. But Christ is calling us to that type of relationship with him. And as Peter, he's like, "Well, what about this guy?" Total big brother type move. "Jesus, I know you're telling me that I'm gonna die a pretty gruesome way. What about this guy?" Just like, Peter, do you hope that he does too? Like, I don't really understand this. Jesus says, "Peter, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I've called him to. It matters what I've called you to." Verse 24. "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have enough room for the books that would be written." Even the whole world wouldn't have enough room for the books that would be written. What Jesus did through his life was absolutely incredible and absolutely astonishing. And if we had the conversations that he and his disciples had, if we had that moment when Jesus shows up and talks to the guys on the road to Emmaus, he takes the Old Testament, he says, "These are all things about me." If we had that conversation, I would be giddy. Like, I desperately want to know what Jesus said in those moments. But it's John's writing. We don't, literally the world, well, he's probably meaning figuratively, but I'm not sure. The world doesn't have enough space to tell the story. And I think what John also would be getting at is that story, it continues with you. So one of the most important things for us to understand is that Jesus is not simply a historical figure who lived, who died, who rose again, but his interactions with us is still part of telling that story. So as we share the testimony of who Jesus is, we also should share, and this is what he has done in my life. Meaning that that story does not stop. It keeps going. And that the world continues to be filled with the stories of who Jesus is and what he's done, because he hasn't stopped writing it involving your life. And we, like Peter, in moments, all of a sudden we're going, oh, we messed this up. Jesus, I really messed this up. And I don't know if I can do this anymore. And Jesus says, yeah, you can. Come on back. I'm going to ask the worship team if you'll come up. You know, if we were to say, tell me some of the best things you've done, some of us would have a really hard time sharing those things. Sometimes it's humility, sometimes it's false humility, sometimes it's just we don't think we've done anything that great. But if we were to say, tell me some of your failures, maybe you'd have a hard time sharing them, but you would know them instantly. You would easily be able to say, oh, yeah, there's this and there's this and there's this, and nobody knows these things. Maybe people do. Sometimes our failures are very public and sometimes they're private. But we have that moment and we're like, okay, so Jesus is calling us back to him, but we have that campfire moment where a smell or a sight, or where we hear the voice of the devil saying, remember you failed. John doesn't allude us to that part of the story, but I believe that it's there. That in that moment that Satan is whispering in Peter's ear, you failure, you don't get to do this. So much of what John writes is about light shining into darkness. That Jesus is the light. And you can see that in the story, that as Peter is there, Jesus is saying, come on back. Come on back. No matter what you've done, come on back. That there is no failure that makes you too far, too separated. So I don't know what failures you're holding on to. Maybe they're spiritual. Maybe they're workplace related. Maybe they're marital. But none of that can separate you from God. That doesn't mean that we didn't fail. So Peter, he failed. He would say, yep, I messed up. There are times in my life where I would tell you, yes, absolutely, I failed. I didn't do that well enough. I sinned. But that doesn't count me out. That doesn't mean those things aren't important. Doesn't mean that failure is something that we can just say, hey, I'm going to fail, so let's do it well. But Jesus would consistently look at us and say, you're not done. As Peter would smell that campfire, Jesus would say, yeah, remember the last time you sat by a campfire? I'm still here for you. I'm going to ask those who are prepared to service communion if you'd get ready at this time. We do communion about once a month. And it is not something that we do just to do, but to do it as a form of remembering what Jesus has done for us. Now, at Carroll First, we have open communion, meaning that anybody can take communion. We do ask that you take it seriously. And in Corinthians, Paul talks about how we need to evaluate ourselves. So as we have the elements, the bread and the cup, it's important for us to say, Holy Spirit, is there something that I need to change in my life? Is there an area that I'm failing at that I need to get better? Speak it to me. So sometimes you might hear the word convict, which we don't really like, but Holy Spirit, convict me of that. Make sure I know that it's wrong. But Jesus looks at us and says, and come back to the table. I'm going to pray and then we can pass out the elements. God, we hear your voice. We hear you calling us back to you. We can remember our failures better than we can remember our successes. So Jesus, speak healing and life into us, over us, in spite of our failures. Call us back to relationship. Call us back to mission with you.